Everyone told her to throw it out. The old dresser her aunt had left behind was warped, water-stained, and smelled of cedar and decades. But when her cat refused to leave the corner where it stood, the woman pulled back the bottom drawer and discovered a hidden panel that no one in the family had ever known about. What she found inside would change everything. She thought she understood about the quiet woman who had raised her, and about the fortune that had been hiding in plain sight for over 60 years. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The morning her aunt died, Clara Weston was standing in a hospital corridor, holding a paper cup of cold coffee, and listening to a nurse explain something she could not quite absorb. The words came in carefully arranged order, as clinical words always did, and she nodded at the right intervals, but the meaning of them kept sliding away from her. Vivienne Weston had been 81 years old, the last surviving member of Clara's immediate family, and now she was gone. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and through a small square window above the nurse's shoulder, Clara could see the flat gray sky of a November morning pressing down on the rooftops of Portland, Oregon, as though the whole city had bowed its head. Clara was 43 years old, a high school art teacher who had never married, who lived alone in a rented apartment on the east side of the city with too many houseplants and a gray tabby cat named Hector. Her students thought she was quietly eccentric, not the kind of teacher who brought in actual oil paintings on loan from acquaintances and spoke about brushwork with a reverence other people reserved for religion. Her neighbors thought she was reserved. Her colleagues thought she was thoughtful. The truth was that she had grown up belonging to only two people in the world, her mother, who had died when Clara was 11, and her aunt Vivienne, who had taken her in without discussion, without complaint, and without ever making her feel like an obligation. Vivienne had been a librarian by profession and a private person by nature, a woman who measured her words as carefully as a pharmacist measured doses, and who had strong opinions about the correct way to shelve a book and the importance of silence as a form of respect. After the paperwork was signed and the formalities completed, Clara drove to Vivienne's house for the first time since the previous Christmas. It was a narrow craftsman bungalow on the east side of Portland, 2 blocks from a park where Vivienne had walked every morning, regardless of weather, until her hips made that impossible. The house was tidy on the outside, the garden still holding the ghost of summer in its bare rose canes, and the neat edge of a gravel path leading to the front door. Inside, it smelled exactly as it always had: cedar and old paper, and the faint ghost of the lavender sachets her aunt tucked into every drawer. The rooms were unchanged. Shelves ran floor to ceiling in the living room, filled with books organized by subject and then by author in a system that Clara had grown up learning to navigate. So a small writing desk sat near the window with a green glass lamp and a ceramic mug holding pencils. The kitchen was clean, its surfaces bare, except for a wooden cutting board and a kettle. Everything in the house had the quality of a life lived with deliberate care, each object chosen and placed, nothing without a reason. In the back bedroom, behind the door that had always been Vivienne's and had always remained slightly ajar whenever Clara visited, stood the dresser. It was a large piece, a Victorian-era bureau of dark walnut with a beveled mirror mounted above the top surface. The wood was old enough to show the history of its years in the grain, warped slightly at the lower right corner where moisture had once gotten in, the mirror backing foxed with age, so that her reflection appeared to her slightly smoky and indistinct. 3 wide drawers ran along the bottom, and 2 narrow ones framed a small central cabinet at the top. Clara had always known this piece of furniture. It had stood in this room for as long as she could remember, and before that, according to her aunt, it had stood in a house in Astoria, where Vivienne had grown up. It was among the oldest things she had ever touched. She stood in the doorway for a long time without entering. The house felt different now that its occupant was gone, as all houses do when the person who gave them their particular character has been removed. The silence was a different quality of silence, no longer the peaceful quiet of a woman who preferred it, but the emptiness of a room waiting to be told what it was for. When she finally crossed the threshold, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the dresser for a while, the way she sometimes looked at paintings she did not yet understand. There was something in its presence that had always unsettled her slightly, not in any frightening way, but in the way that certain objects carry a weight of time beyond their obvious surfaces. She had never been able to say what it was about this particular piece of furniture that made her feel that way, and she had never thought to ask. The will, when she received a copy several days later, left her everything. There was no surprise in that. There had been no one else. But among the sparse language of the document, one sentence caught her attention. It was not the usual legal phrasing of property transfer and asset distribution. It was a note her aunt had added in a separate handwritten addendum, for it was attached to the formal document with a paper clip. It read, "Do not sell the dresser until you have looked at it the way I taught you to look at things." Clara read the sentence 3 times. She could hear her aunt's voice in it exactly, dry and precise, and pointing towards something without pointing directly. What Vivienne had taught her to look at things, in the context of their shared history, meant one thing. She had taught Clara to look at art not by standing back from it, but by moving close, by examining the surface for what the maker had put into it, that a casual eye would miss. She had taught her that things revealed themselves not at first glance, but at the 5th or the 10th, when you had stopped expecting the obvious and started listening to the details. Clara drove back to the house the following Saturday. She brought Hector, who rode in a soft carrier on the back seat, and watched the city pass with the serene disinterest of a creature who had decided long ago that most things were beneath his concern. When they arrived, she set the carrier down in the bedroom and opened it, and the cat stepped out, stretched elaborately, and immediately walked to the corner where the dresser stood. He sat before it with his tail curled around his feet, and his yellow eyes fixed on the lower left side of the frame, at the gap between the baseboard and the bottom of the piece. Clara noticed this but said nothing, because she was used to Hector's preoccupations, and had learned not to dismiss them entirely. She spent the first hour doing what she had come to do, looking. She started at the top, examining the mirror frame, which was carved with a repeating pattern of leaves and what she had always taken to be a decorative border, but which she now, looking more carefully, saw contained something else embedded in the pattern. Small shapes recurred in the carving at intervals, not leaves at all, but something more deliberate, tiny keys carved into the wood, at a scale that made them invisible unless you were searching. She counted 6 of them, each slightly different from the others, worked into the border with a precision that no casual furniture maker would have bothered with. She moved lower, running her hands along the sides of the piece, pressing gently as a restorer might, feeling for any gyve in the wood, any anomaly in the surface. The walnut was dense and old, and most of it was solid as stone beneath her fingers. But when she reached the lower left panel below the bottom drawer, the same place Hector was still watching, her fingers found it. A seam, almost invisible, running parallel to the drawer face, about 3 inches above the floor. She would never have seen it. She would never have noticed it from across the room, or even from a foot away. But under the pressure of her hand, she felt it give, very slightly, as if something behind it were waiting. She sat back on her heels and looked at the cat. He blinked at her once, slowly, the way cats do when they are trying to communicate patience. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. She spent the next 20 minutes trying to understand the mechanism. There was no visible latch, no keyhole, no pull. She pressed along the seam in different places, Amma knocked gently, listened to the change in resonance. When she pressed at the far right end of the seam, and then pressed simultaneously near the top left, something released. The panel swung outward on a hinge so fine and old that it moved without a sound, as if it had been designed to open without announcing itself. Behind the panel was darkness and the smell of something Clara could only describe as old wealth, the dry mineral tang of metal that had been enclosed for a very long time. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The space behind the panel was roughly 14 inches wide, 8 inches tall, and perhaps a foot deep, carved into the solid base of the dresser with remarkable precision. It had been lined at some point with a material that had dried and cracked with age, something leathery and dark. And filling the space, arranged in rows with the meticulous order of a person who thought everything deserved its proper place, were coins. They were in small wooden trays, each tray holding a row of coins, separated by thin dividers. Most were in cloth sleeves, small envelopes of chamois leather. Others sat loose in the trays. Clara picked up one of the cloth sleeves and drew out the coin inside with the careful fingers of someone who had spent 20 years handling delicate things. It was gold. She was certain of that from the weight alone before the flashlight confirmed it. A warm, heavy disk, the color of amber in sunlight. On its face, she could make out a figure in profile and lettering she could not immediately read. On the reverse, an eagle with wings spread above a shield. The date below the eagle read, 1854. Why, she sat very still for a moment, the coin resting on her palm, and felt the specific vertigo that comes when a familiar world suddenly reorders itself around an unfamiliar fact. She drove home that evening with Hector on the seat beside her, and the dresser still in the house, untouched. She had replaced the coin in its sleeve, closed the panel, and photographed everything she could with her phone before leaving, compulsively documenting what she had found, the way an art teacher documents a new discovery, with systematic attention and without disturbing the original arrangement. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her apartment listening to Hector move through the dark rooms and thought about her aunt, about the careful, contained life the woman had lived, about the librarian's salary that had been enough but never extravagant, so about the house that was paid off and the small savings account listed in the estate, and about a hidden compartment full of gold coins that Vivienne Weston had apparently carried through 60 years of ordinary life without ever telling anyone. The next morning, she called a numismatist. She had to look the word up to find it, and then she found 3 within driving distance of Portland, one of whom specialized in American coinage and had a website that mentioned significant estates and private collections. She made an appointment without explaining what she had found, only that she had inherited some coins and wanted an assessment. The man's name was Gerald Fitch, and he was 60 years old, with the careful hands and quiet voice of someone who had spent a career handling things that required both. And he met her at the house rather than his office, which she had requested, not wanting to move anything until she understood what she was dealing with. When she opened the panel and showed him the trays, he was quiet for a long time. He picked up coins one at a time, turning them gently in the light, replacing each one before touching the next. His expression did not change in any way that Clara could read clearly, but she noticed that his hands, so steadfast with each coin, had developed a faint tremor by the time he reached the third tray. There were 87 coins in total. When he finished looking, Gerald Fitch set down his loupe and straightened his back and looked at Clara with an expression that was somewhere between professional reserve and barely managed astonishment. He told her that among the coins were examples she would need to understand carefully before any decision was made. He mentioned names she did not yet know: the 1854 S quarter eagle, a small gold coin struck at the San Francisco Mint in its first year of operation. The 1907 ultra-high-relief St. Gaudens double eagle, a coin created under the direction of Theodore Roosevelt by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens in an effort to make American coinage as beautiful as ancient Greek currency. An 1879 Stella, a $4 gold pattern coin that had never entered circulation. He did not give her numbers that day. He told her he needed to make calls, to consult with colleagues, to look at auction records. He called her 4 days later. The number he gave her was $198 million. Clara was standing in her classroom when the call came, at the end of the school day, with the late afternoon light coming through the windows at an angle that lit up the dust in the air and turned the surface of every painting on the walls to gold. She asked him to repeat the number. He did. She thanked him and ended the call, and stood for a while looking at a reproduction of a Rembrandt self-portrait that she had kept on the wall for 11 years, because she believed it was the most honest depiction of a human face she had ever seen. She did not tell anyone for 2 weeks, not her colleagues, not the neighbors who knew her aunt's house, not the distant cousins who had attended Vivienne's funeral in dutiful obligation, and whose primary concern upon leaving the service had been audible to Clara as she stood near the coat rack, whether there was anything worth taking from the estate before the house was sold. She had heard 2 of them, a man named Kenneth, who had come up from Sacramento, and a woman named Deirdre from Bend, discussing the furniture in the house with the dismissive fluency of people who knew the price of things and nothing of their value. She had heard the word junk spoken more than once. She had heard the dresser mentioned specifically, described as an eyesore and a liability, a piece of Victorian furniture that nobody wanted and that would cost money to dispose of. She had said nothing, and she had given them the polite and unremarkable responses that the occasion required, and had watched them leave with the clean conscience of people who believe they have correctly assessed a situation. The 2 weeks of silence were not paralysis. They were research. Clara was, in the end, an art teacher, and art teachers know that the proper response to a significant find is not immediate action, but patient study. She read everything she could find about rare American coinage. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in inheritance law, and then a second one who had handled estates involving significant asset discovery. She had conversations with auction houses in New York, speaking carefully and hypothetically at first, then more directly once she understood the landscape. She hired a conservator to assess the condition of the coins and the manner in which they had been stored, and was told that the chamois leather and the dry enclosed environment of the wood had created conditions so favorable that the coins had been preserved with an effectiveness that professional storage facilities would have struggled to match. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. That knowledge pulled her back to her aunt every time. The more she learned, the less the discovery made sense in the context of the woman she had known, and the more it demanded a different kind of looking. She had loved Vivienne completely and without reservation, the way people love the things that save them. But she was beginning to understand that she had loved a version of her aunt shaped by what Vivienne had chosen to show her, and that the woman behind that version was larger and more complex than the quiet librarian who had walked to the park each morning and returned overdue books without making anyone feel embarrassed about the late fees. She found the first letter in the cedar chest at the foot of Vivienne's bed, which she had not yet opened because she had been approaching the house in layers, not wanting to exhaust its secrets all at once. The letter was in an envelope addressed in a hand she did not recognize, postmarked San Francisco, 1962. It was written to Vivienne, but used a name Clara had never heard, addressed to a Vivienne Marchand. The surname her aunt had been born with, before the marriage that had lasted only 4 years and ended before Clara's mother was born, was something she had never thought to investigate. The letter was from a man who signed himself only as R. The language was formal in the way that letters from that era were formal, but beneath the formality, there was a current of something urgent. The writer spoke of arrangements completed, of items transferred according to the agreement, of his certainty that she would understand the importance of discretion. He mentioned a mutual acquaintance who had recently come to grief through incaution and used that grief as an argument for the protection of what they had agreed to protect. He did not use the word coins. He did not name any specific objects. But at the bottom of the letter, in smaller writing that felt different from the rest, as if added as an afterthought, he had written, "The collection is worth more than any of us can say now. In 30 years or 50, it will be worth more still. You are the right keeper. I have always known that." There were 11 more letters in the chest, spanning from 1962 to 1987. Clara read them all in sequence, sitting on the floor of the bedroom with Hector beside her, and assembled from them a picture that was incomplete, but extraordinary. Vivienne had known this man, R., through a network of private collectors who had operated in the 1950s and 60s in the space between legitimate numismatic circles and something less formal. The man was clearly knowledgeable, deeply so, and clearly trusted Vivienne with a responsibility that the letters returned to again and again. The preservation of a collection whose significance would not be understood for decades, and a collection assembled at a moment when certain coins were undervalued and underappreciated, when the market had not yet caught up with the history. The last letter, dated 1987, was different from the others. The handwriting was shakier, the sentences shorter. The man who wrote it was clearly older and perhaps unwell. He said only that he had no heirs who would understand what the collection meant, that the people in his life were not equipped to be its keepers, and that he was grateful beyond what language could hold that it had spent 25 years in the right hands. He told Vivienne she would know when the time was right to act on it, if that time ever came. He said that if it never came in her lifetime, she would find a way to ensure it reached a person who could understand it after her. He ended the letter with a sentence that Clara read 4 times before she trusted her understanding of it. "Some things are not meant to make us wealthy. They are meant to make us responsible." She sat with that sentence for a long time. When she finally told the people she needed to tell, she did so in the order that felt right. The lawyer first, then the auction house, then Gerald Fitch again, who had been patient and professional through 2 weeks of her silence, with the grace of a man who had dealt with the shock of significant discovery before, and understood that it required time. She called the museum curator at a major university, who had responded to one of her inquiries with genuine curiosity, and whose subsequent correspondence had convinced her that he was someone who cared about the coins for what they represented historically, on not only what they were worth monetarily. She did not call Kenneth or Deirdre. The news, when it became public, moved through the world the way news does now, quickly, and with the particular distortions of speed. The figure was reported accurately in some places and wildly in others. Some accounts were interested in the money, others were more interested in the story, the librarian, the hidden panel, the 60 years of quiet custodianship. Clara gave one interview to a journalist who had written sensitively about another estate discovery several years prior and whom she had found through careful research. She spoke about her aunt with the precision of someone who had spent weeks reconsidering everything she thought she knew, and in the process had arrived at a deeper understanding rather than a revised one. Vivienne had not been hiding anything from Clara out of distrust or indifference. She had been waiting for the moment when Clara was ready to receive it, and she had structured that moment with the same meticulous care with which she shelved books and tended roses and raised a grieving child into a functioning adult. The note in the will had not been vague. It had been exact. It had pointed Clara to the only tool she had been given that was adequate to the task, the habit of looking closely, looking past the surface, trusting that what was worth finding would reveal itself to the patient and the attentive. The cousins called when the story ran. Kenneth's message was brief and careful in the way that people are careful when they believe they may have been wrong but are not yet prepared to say so. Deirdre left a voicemail that expressed something she framed as happiness for Clara, and that Clara listened to once and did not return. There was a meeting with lawyers about the estate and the classification of the discovery under Oregon inheritance law. There were conversations about taxes, about the appropriate handling of items of historical significance, about what public institutions might have standing to petition for access. These conversations were long and sometimes difficult, and Clara navigated them with the same patience she brought to difficult students and complicated paintings, holding her position without rigidity, listening without capitulating, arriving eventually at arrangements that satisfied the requirements of the law and the directives of her own conscience. When she decided to sell most of the collection through a major auction house, retaining 3 coins for what she thought of as the right reasons. One was the 1907 double eagle, which she had looked at long enough to understand what Augustus St. Gaudens had meant to make, and what he had largely succeeded in making. A small gold disc that was genuinely beautiful in the way that the best human-made things are genuinely beautiful, not just in their market price, but in the intention behind their surface. One was a coin of modest value, but personal resonance, a small gold piece whose date matched the year her aunt had been born. And one was a coin she had chosen purely because Hector had sat beside its tray with particular intensity on the day she had laid them all out for the conservator's assessment, and she had decided that this preference deserved to be honored. The proceeds from the sale, after taxes and fees, were substantial in the precise sense of the word. They were enough to change the material conditions of her life in ways that were not trivial. But what she found herself thinking about more than the money was what to do with the knowledge her aunt had passed to her in the form of the collection and the letters. The man who had assembled it, R., whose full name she eventually learned through a genealogist she hired for the purpose, had believed that certain things carried a responsibility beyond their market value. He had not been a saint. The letters made it clear he had operated in gray spaces and made compromises she could not entirely approve of. But his final conviction, expressed in that last shaky letter, Anna had been genuine. She established a small foundation in her aunt's name. Its purpose was narrow and specific: the acquisition and long-term preservation of historically significant American numismatic pieces that were at risk of being sold privately into collections from which they might not emerge for generations. It was not a large foundation. It did not aspire to be a museum. It was, as she explained to the lawyer who helped her structure it, less a public institution than a form of extended custodianship, a way of ensuring that the responsibility her aunt had carried did not end with the sale of the collection, but transformed into something that could continue. Gerald Fitch joined its small advisory board. So did the university curator. So, eventually, I did a young researcher from the Smithsonian who had written her a letter after the interview was published, a letter so thoughtful in its engagement with the history of the coins that she had read it 3 times and then called him. The dresser remained in the bedroom of the house on the east side of Portland. Clara did not sell the house. She moved into it eventually, gradually, the way a person moves into a life that was built for them by someone who understood them more clearly than they understood themselves. She brought her houseplants and her books, and her reproduction Rembrandt and Hector, who settled immediately into the routines of the house, with the confidence of a cat returning somewhere he had always intended to be. She spent a weekend cleaning the dresser carefully, the way a conservator cleans an important piece, and with appropriate materials and deliberate patience. She removed decades of accumulated wax from the carvings and found that the small keys worked into the decorative border were even more precise than she had originally noticed. She had the warped corner assessed and stabilized. She oiled the wood and polished the mirror backing, and found that once the foxing was treated, her reflection appeared to her clearly, without distortion. She left the hidden panel as it was. She did not have it sealed or altered. On the days when she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the dresser, the way her aunt had taught her to look at things, she could see the seam if she knew where to look. She thought that was as it should be. Some secrets are not hidden to be kept forever. They are hidden to be found by the right person at the right time. And after that, they earn the right to be visible. The story had several afterlives in addition to her own. The auction, when it occurred, was attended and followed by a community of collectors and historians who treated it as something between a market event and a historical occasion, which was more or less what it was. Several of the coins sold for prices that set new records. The St. Gaudens double eagle found its buyer in a private collector in Switzerland, who, according to his representative, intended to loan it to a major exhibition within the year. The 1854 S quarter eagle went to an institution, which gave Clara more satisfaction than any private sale could have. An institution would take care of it. An institution had obligations. Kenneth called once more, 6 months after the auction. He was more direct this time. He said that he had been rude about the dresser at the funeral, and that he was sorry. Clara told him the apology was accepted, and meant it. She was not a person who found grudges worth maintaining, but she also did not offer the clarification he was clearly hoping for, the one that would have allowed him to understand what he had missed. He would have to arrive at that understanding on his own, which, she reflected, was the only way people ever really arrived at understandings that mattered. Hector lived for 3 more years in the Craftsman bungalow on the east side of Portland, in the room with the dresser, in the company of a woman who had learned from the woman before her that a life of quiet attention and careful preservation was not a small life. He died on a Thursday in October, on the bed in the late afternoon, in a bar of sunlight that came through the window at the angle that made everything it touched look slightly more significant than it usually did. She buried him in the garden, under the bare rose canes, next to a stone she had painted herself, with the care she brought to everything she chose to make permanent. She bought another cat eventually, a young gray tabby she found at the shelter, who had the same coloring as Hector, and none of his temperament, and all of his curiosity about the furniture in the back bedroom. She named him August, for the man who had made a small gold coin more beautiful than it had any reason to be, and had not lived to see what that beauty was worth. On the first morning, she woke in the house, and understood that she had stopped thinking of it as her aunt's house, and started thinking of it as her own. She made coffee in the kitchen the way Vivienne had always made it, strong and without ceremony, and carried the mug to the back bedroom and sat on the bed and looked at the dresser. August sat beside her. The light came through the curtains at an angle that caught the carved keys in the border and made them briefly clear. Those small, deliberate shapes worked into the decoration by a maker whose name she hadn't been able to find, who had built into a piece of furniture a secret that had outlasted everyone who first knew about it. She thought about what it meant to keep something, not to hoard it, not to display it, but to hold it with the right quality of attention until the moment arrived when it was ready to become what it had always been intended to be. She thought about her aunt walking to the park every morning with her careful steps and her quiet conviction. She thought about a man writing a shaky letter in 1987 and trusting that the woman who received it would do the right thing, even if neither of them knew yet what the right thing was. She finished her coffee and stood and opened the window and let in the cold November air that smelled of leaves and rain and the particular Portland morning that she had been waking up to all her adult life. Outside, the rose canes moved slightly in the wind. The garden held its careful order, the gravel path still edged, the borders still neat, maintained now by her hands instead of her aunt's. She was not a wealthy woman in the way that a headline would describe wealthy. She was comfortable, which was different, which was more. She had work she believed in, and a house that was paid for, and the foundation that would outlast her, and a dresser in the back bedroom that had stood in 2 houses across more than a century, and had, in its patient and silent way, been the best teacher she had ever had. She closed the window and went to make another cup of coffee, and thought that sometimes the most important things in a life are the things that everyone else is ready to call junk, the things that require you to look closely, to stay when leaving would be easier, to trust that what has been preserved with care is worth the patience that preservation demands. She thought that her aunt had known this. She thought that she had been trying to teach it to her for 40 years. She thought that she had finally learned it. She had not expected the letters to keep arriving, and the first one came in February, 3 months after the auction closed, and the story had moved through its public life and settled into the quieter after-existence that all stories eventually find. It arrived in a standard white envelope with a return address in Pasadena, California, and her name and the house address written in a hand that was old and deliberate. The penmanship of someone who had learned to write when writing was considered a discipline. She opened it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, while August watched from the counter with the supreme indifference of a cat who has decided that paper is beneath him, but will monitor proceedings nonetheless. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on cream stationery, and it began without preamble. My name is Rosalind Fay, and I am 84 years old, and I knew your aunt for approximately 11 years beginning in 1963. I have been following the news of your discovery with feelings I will attempt to describe accurately rather than simply. I am writing to you because I believe there are things you deserve to know about Vivienne that the letters in the cedar chest, which I assume you found, do not contain. Clara set down her coffee cup. Rosalind Fay. It emerged over the course of 3 letters and 1 telephone call that lasted almost 2 hours, had been the woman through whom Vivienne had first been introduced to the man who signed his letters, R. His full name, which the genealogist had eventually provided, was Raymond Calloway, and he had been a dealer in rare books and documents who had, in the 1950s and early 1960s, developed a secondary and more consuming interest in American numismatics. He was not a wealthy man in the inherited sense. He was a man who understood value before markets confirmed it, which is a different and rarer kind of intelligence, and which had made him, by the early 1960s, the quiet center of a small and serious community of collectors who trusted one another with the specific intensity of people who believe they are custodians of something the general public is not yet equipped to appreciate. Vivienne had come to this community sideways through her friendship with Rosalind, who had known Raymond through his bookshop in San Francisco. She had not been a collector herself. She had been, in Raymond's words, which Rosalind quoted from memory, with a precision that Clara found both touching and slightly eerie, for the most reliable person I have ever encountered in any field of human activity, and reliability is the rarest thing there is. What Rosalind wanted Clara to understand, and stated plainly once they had established enough telephone rapport for plainness to feel appropriate, was that Vivienne had not been a passive repository for Raymond's collection. She had been its architect in the years after he could no longer function in that role. 3 of the 87 coins, including the 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle, had been acquired by Vivienne herself, using her own savings, on Raymond's guidance, in the late 1960s, when those coins could still be purchased at prices that now seemed impossible. She had known what she was buying. She had known what she was holding. And she had made the decision, decades before the market confirmed her judgment, that the collection would be preserved whole rather than sold piecemeal. Clara thanked Rosalind and meant it, and spent the following evening sitting with that information, in the way she had learned to sit with significant things, quietly and without rushing toward a conclusion. What had changed was not the facts of what had happened, but the resolution of the picture, the way a painting changes when you move close enough to see the individual marks of the brush and understand that what looked like an effortless surface was the result of sustained and deliberate labor. Her aunt had not simply been a keeper. She had been, in her own quiet and unannounced way, a scholar and a strategist. The woman who organized library shelves and walked to the park and made coffee strong and without ceremony had also, in the private hours of a private life, made investment decisions of extraordinary acuity on behalf of a collection she believed in, carrying that responsibility across 4 decades without once suggesting to anyone who knew her that there was anything unusual about her interior life. Clara thought about this for a long time. Then she called Rosalind back and asked if she would be willing to write down what she remembered of Vivienne, formally, for the Foundation's archive. Rosalind said she would be glad to, and the way she said it, quickly, and with a warmth that came through the phone line cleanly despite the distance and the years, made Clara understand that she had been waiting to be asked. If you are watching from somewhere that has a story like this one buried in it, leave a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The second unexpected development arrived not by letter, but in person, on a Tuesday morning in March, in the form of a man who rang the doorbell and stood on the porch, holding a manila envelope with both hands, as if it contained something fragile. He was perhaps 70, compact and careful in his movements, with the slightly formal bearing of someone who has prepared extensively for a conversation they are not certain will be welcome. He introduced himself as David Calloway, Raymond's son. She invited him in without hesitation, because she had learned from both her aunt and the events of the preceding months that the people who arrived carrying things were usually the people worth listening to, and because the way he held the envelope told her that whatever was inside it, he had carried it for a long time and was relieved to be close to setting it down. He sat at the kitchen table where she had read Rosalind's letter, and August came to inspect him with the thorough, nose-to-knee methodology he applied to all new arrivals, and David Calloway submitted to this inspection with the patience of a man who understood that certain evaluations were not optional. Then he opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, 31 of them, black and white, printed on the slightly glossy paper of mid-century darkroom work, on the kind that had a particular quality of light and shadow that digital photography had never quite managed to replicate. They were photographs of coins, each one meticulously composed, each one lit to show the full relief of the surface detail, each one labeled on the back in a handwriting Clara recognized immediately as Raymond's. David had found them in a box his father had left in a storage unit in San Francisco, a box that had been paid for through automatic bank withdrawal for 38 years, and that David had discovered only when the bank sent a notification that the account funding it had finally been fully depleted. He had opened the storage unit expecting nothing, and had found, along with various papers and books, the photographs and a sealed letter addressed to him in his father's hand. The letter told him about the collection, and about Vivienne, and about the decision his father had made to entrust it to a woman he believed to be more capable of carrying it than anyone else he had known. It also told him something he had not known, and that Clara had not found any evidence of in the cedar chest letters. Raymond Calloway had loved Vivienne Weston, not in a way that had expressed itself or asked for anything in return. In a way that had simply existed alongside everything else, a private fact he had apparently carried without burdening her with it, understanding that she was not available to him in that sense, and that what they had, the trust and the shared conviction and the correspondence across decades, was already a form of intimacy that most people never found in any form. He had written this in the letter to his son, not as a complaint or a confession, but as an explanation. He wanted David to know why the collection had gone where it went, and he wanted him to understand that the woman who held it had been worthy of the trust, and that the trust itself had been one of the central facts of his father's life, even if it had never been visible to anyone looking from the outside. Clara read the letter that David had brought with him, reading it slowly at the kitchen table, with August asleep on the chair beside her, and the March light coming through the window at the angle that made the kitchen feel like a painting. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the photographs spread across the table. Those careful black and white records of objects that a man had spent his working life assembling with the conviction that they mattered. She thought about what it meant to love something you could not have, and to respond to that impossibility, not with bitterness or withdrawal, but with devotion to the thing you could give. Raymond had given Vivienne the collection and his trust and 30 years of letters and the best of his knowledge and judgment, and he had asked for nothing except that she keep it safe. And she had kept it safe. And now, here was his son, sitting across from a woman his father had never met, delivering the final piece of a story that had been too large and too private to fit inside any single life. She asked David if he wanted anything from the estate. He said no immediately, and in a way that made her believe him. The way that some refusals are clearly refusals, and not the performance of refusal that is actually an invitation to be pressed. He said he had come because the letter asked him to, and because he felt he owed it to his father to close the circle properly, and because he had wondered all his adult life what kind of person his father was beneath the bookshop and the careful exterior, and now he thought he understood, and the understanding was not painful. It was, he said, with a precision that reminded her of something she couldn't immediately name, and then could. It was a form of inheritance. She gave him one of the photographs, the one labeled 1907 on the back in Raymond's hand, which was the coin she had kept. He looked at it for a long time, and then folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, and thanked her, and left. She watched him walk down the gravel path between the rose canes and thought that the house had now done what it had been designed to do, not by any deliberate planning, but by the accumulated intention of everyone who had lived in it and everything that had been kept within it. It had been a place where things arrived and were received and were properly honored and then released. The foundation had its first formal meeting in April. It was a small gathering, 5 people around the table in the front room of the house that had once been Vivienne's reading room, and that Clara had kept as nearly as possible in its original arrangement, the shelves of books organized in the system her aunt had developed, the green glass lamp on the writing desk, the ceramic mug holding pencils. Gerald Fitch was there, and the curator from the university, whose name was Marcus, and who had the slightly distracted intensity of a person whose mind is perpetually running several conversations simultaneously. The young researcher from the Smithsonian, whose name was Will, had driven up from the airport that morning and arrived 20 minutes early and spent the intervening time looking at the books with the contained excitement of someone trying hard not to appear excited. And Rosalind Fay, who had agreed to come up from Pasadena for the meeting, and who turned out to be a small, upright woman with white hair and very dark eyes, and the manner of someone who has decided that at 84, the most respectful thing she can do for other people's time is to say precisely what she means. They talked for 3 hours. The foundation would not seek to build a collection of its own in the conventional sense. It would function as what Clara had described to the lawyer as a preservation network, identifying coins of historical and cultural significance that were at risk of disappearing into private collections from which they might not emerge for generations, and working to ensure that these objects found homes in institutions where they could be studied and seen. It would operate quietly. It would not seek publicity. It would, as Rosalind said at one point, with the tone of a woman summarizing a position she had held for 6 decades, do the work and let the work speak. They agreed on these terms without significant disagreement. Clara had the impression, watching the 5 of them around the table, that they had each been shaped by a similar conviction, or that certain things carried a responsibility beyond their monetary value, and that accepting that responsibility was not a burden, but a form of privilege. She thought about Raymond's last letter to Vivienne, about the sentence that had stayed with her. Some things are not meant to make us wealthy. They are meant to make us responsible. She had not quoted it in the meeting. She had not needed to. It was already the premise they were all operating from. After the others left, Rosalind stayed for dinner. They sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup Clara had made that morning, and talked about Vivienne in the way that Clara had not yet been able to talk about her with anyone else. Not because other people were unwilling, but because they had not known her well enough to know what they were talking about. Rosalind had known her. Rosalind had watched her make the decision to take the collection, had watched her navigate the years in which keeping it had required a particular kind of vigilance, had watched her raise Clara and teach school and run her library and hold the quiet core of the whole arrangement together through 4 decades without once appearing to be anything other than what she presented to the world. A careful, private, deeply competent woman who preferred books to noise and chose her words as if they were limited in number. She told Clara something that evening that she had not mentioned in the letters or the phone calls, perhaps because it required sitting across a table from her to say. She said that Vivienne had spoken about Clara often in the years when Clara was growing up in her house, and that what she had said was always the same thing in different forms. She said that the child sees things. She said it with pride, Rosalind told her. With the specific pride of someone who knows they are raising something that will outlast them. Clara did not respond to this immediately. She refilled their water glasses and looked at the table and let the words settle the way her aunt had taught her to let things settle without rushing to manage them. Then she said that she thought she had spent most of her adult life looking at things carefully and feeling that this was a slightly eccentric habit rather than a skill, and that it had taken a hidden compartment full of gold coins and a stack of 60-year-old letters for her to understand that the habit had been given to her deliberately, as a specific and intentional preparation for a specific and intentional purpose. Rosalind looked at her across the table with those very dark eyes and said, "Yes, that is exactly right, and I have been waiting for a long time for you to know that." The summer that followed was the quietest and the fullest that Clara had spent in years. She taught her classes at the school where she had worked for 18 years, standing in the same room with the same Rembrandt reproduction on the wall and the same late-afternoon light coming through the windows and turning the dust to gold, and found that the teaching felt different now in a way she struggled at first to articulate and then understood. She had always taught her students to look closely. She had always told them that the surface was never the whole story, that the most important information in any work of art was embedded in the details that a hurried eye would pass over. She had believed this, and said it, and meant it. But she had been saying it somewhat abstractly, the way a person teaches a lesson they have learned from books rather than from experience. Now she was saying it from experience. Now she had actually opened the panel. Now she knew in her body, not just in her mind, what it meant to look at something ordinary long enough to see what was extraordinary inside it. Her students, she discovered, could tell the difference. The lesson had not changed, but the authority behind it had, and authority of that particular kind is not invisible to 17-year-olds, who are more sensitive to the difference between genuine knowledge and performed knowledge than most adults give them credit for. She took her class to see an exhibition in October, a collection of American art from the 19th century that included 3 paintings she had wanted them to see for different reasons. In the last room of the exhibition, in a corner that most of the visitors seemed to move past without pausing, there was a small, still life, oil on panel, perhaps 12 inches by 14, depicting a table with a few objects arranged on it. A ceramic bowl, a piece of fruit, a folded cloth, and in the background, almost obscured by shadow, the corner of a box. The painting was attributed to an unknown artist. It had been in the museum's collection for decades, acquired from an estate, its provenance uncertain. Clara stood in front of it for a long time, while her students moved through the room and then gradually drifted back toward her, drawn by the quality of her attention, if not initially by the painting itself. She pointed out the brushwork in the cloth, the way the unknown artist had suggested texture without belaboring it. She pointed out the light source, which was consistent and deliberate in a way that indicated real technical skill. She pointed out the box in the background, which she told them was not an accident of composition. Nothing in a painting of this quality is an accident of composition, she said. The box is there because the painter wanted it there. The question is what it means that it is partially hidden. One of her students, a girl named Priya, who had the particularly clear eye of someone who had grown up in a family of engineers and had learned that precision was a form of respect, asked what was in the box. Clara smiled and said she didn't know, but she said that the question itself was the right one, and that the painter had meant for them to ask it, and that this was how the best work functioned. It kept the question alive. She thought about this on the drive home. She thought about it in the way she was learning to think about things, not to arrive at a resolution, but to hold the question in the right quality of attention and wait for what it wanted to show her. The house was quiet when she arrived. August greeted her at the door with his habitual ambivalence, and then followed her to the back bedroom, where she sat on the bed and looked at the dresser in the early evening light. The carved keys in the border were visible tonight, the angle of the lamp catching them at the precise degree that made them clear. She had spent enough time looking at the dresser by now that she could find the seam of the panel without searching for it, could feel where to press with the automatic ease of repeated familiarity. She thought about the painter of the still life with the box in the background. She thought about Raymond assembling his collection coin by coin over decades, with the conviction that the market would eventually understand what he understood. She thought about Vivienne walking to the park every morning with her careful steps, carrying in the quiet interior of her life, a responsibility that would have defined most people's entire existence, and somehow making it look like simply living. She thought about what it meant to prepare a person for something without telling them what you are preparing them for, because you cannot know exactly what form the inheritance will take, only that you are shaping the receiver to be ready for whatever form it takes. She thought that this was what good teaching was, not the transmission of specific content, but the cultivation of a specific kind of readiness, the willingness to look closely, the patience to stay with a thing until it showed you what it was, the trust that what had been preserved with care was worth the patience required to find it. She thought that her aunt had been the best teacher she had ever had, and that she had spent 30 years sitting in her classroom without knowing it was a classroom. August jumped onto the bed beside her and walked twice in a circle, and settled with his usual disregard for the geometry of shared space, his back pressed against her hip, his eyes half closed in the lamplight. Outside, the October wind moved through the rose canes, and the garden held its careful order in the dark. Clara reached over and placed her hand flat against the walnut surface of the dresser, feeling the density of the old wood beneath her palm, the faint warmth it had retained from the afternoon sun coming through the curtains, the solidity of a thing that had been made to last and had lasted. She thought about David Calloway with the photograph in his jacket pocket. She thought about Rosalind at 84, waiting to be asked. She thought about Will at the Smithsonian, writing letters with the earnest precision of someone who believed that objects deserved sentences as careful as themselves. She thought about Gerald Fitch's hands developing their tremor over the third tray of coins, She thought about a man in a San Francisco bookshop in 1962 looking at a woman who had just been introduced to him by a mutual friend, and recognizing in her something he had spent his professional life learning to recognize in objects, the presence of interior value that a careless eye would never find. She thought about what it meant that the things worth most in this life almost never announced themselves, that they waited in old dressers and cedar chests and storage units and back corners of exhibition rooms, that they required a particular quality of attention to find, and that the attention itself was a thing that had to be taught and practiced and passed forward like any other form of care. She thought that this was the inheritance, not the coins, though the coins had been real and significant and had changed the material conditions of her life in ways that were not trivial. The inheritance was the instruction embedded in the note her aunt had left with the will. The instruction was not about the dresser. It was about how to look. She had finally learned it. She would spend the rest of her life passing it on. August made the small sound that he made when he was close to sleep, a single soft note of breath that was not quite a purr and not quite a sigh, the sound of a creature settling fully into the present moment without reservation. Clara left her hand on the dresser. The lamplight held the room. The wind moved in the garden outside. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The call came on a Wednesday in November, a year and 3 weeks after the auction, and it was from a woman named Harriet Voss, who identified herself as the director of a small private archive in Philadelphia, and who spoke with the efficient clarity of someone accustomed to making her point before the other person had time to form an objection. She had been following the foundation, she said. She had read the interview Clara had given and the follow-up pieces that others had written, and she had attended, via a live stream she had found through a colleague, at a public panel discussion at the university where Marcus had spoken about the significance of the collection and the history of mid-century American numismatics. She had been interested in all of it, but what she was calling about was not the coins. She was calling about Raymond Calloway. Clara sat down. Harriet Voss's archive, which occupied the upper floors of a narrow building near Rittenhouse Square, and which her grandmother had established in 1941, and which Harriet had run for 30 years, held approximately 14,000 documents relating to American collecting culture in the 20th century. Dealers, private collectors, auction records, correspondence, photographs, ephemera. The archive was not well known outside specialist circles, which was deliberate. Harriet's grandmother had believed that the best way to preserve fragile things was to limit the number of people who knew they existed, a philosophy that her granddaughter had inherited, along with the building and the contents and the ongoing administrative difficulty of maintaining both. Among the 14,000 documents, Harriet told Clara, were 46 letters and 9 photographs relating to Raymond Calloway, donated to the archive in 1991 by a book dealer in San Francisco who had been settling the estate of a colleague and had found them in a box of papers he did not know what else to do with. Harriet had cataloged them herself 20 years ago and had thought about them several times since, in the way that archivists think about items that seem to be waiting for their context to arrive. The context had now arrived, she said, in the form of Clara and the collection and the foundation and the whole unfolding story of what Raymond had assembled and why and where it had ended up. Would Clara come to Philadelphia? She went in December on a Thursday, flying east into a gray sky that brightened as they descended and then produced as the taxi moved through the city streets, a particular quality of winter light that Clara associated with old cities, the kind of light that seems to know it is falling on things that have been standing for a long time and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Harriet met her at the door of the building on Rittenhouse Square, a woman in her early 70s with reading glasses pushed up into white hair and the slightly ink-stained hands of someone who works with paper daily and has stopped worrying about it. So the archive smelled of the same cedar and old paper and mineral thyme that the dresser's hidden compartment had smelled of when Clara first opened it. And she noticed this and said nothing about it, because some correspondences are better carried internally. Harriet had laid out the Callaway materials on a long table in a room at the back of the second floor, each item in its archival sleeve, each sleeve labeled in the neat handwriting of the 1991 cataloging. Clara put on the cotton gloves Harriet provided and began to read. The 46 letters were not from Vivienne or to Vivienne. They were from Raymond to a man named George Tillman, who had been, Clara gathered from the content of the letters, his closest friend from approximately 1948 until Tillman's death in 1979. They were the letters a person writes to someone they trust completely, without editing for posterity, without arranging their thoughts for an audience. They were, in other words, the most honest record that existed of who Raymond Callaway had actually been. He emerged from the letters as a person of considerable complexity. He was funny in a dry, self-deprecating way that surprised her, given the gravity of everything she had already learned about him. He was opinionated about books in a manner that made her smile, particularly his opinions about which authors took too long to say what they meant, and which ones did not take long enough. He was a devoted and occasionally exasperated father, David appearing in the letters from infancy onward, undescribed with a loving specificity that made her think of David sitting at her kitchen table holding the manila envelope, and understand something about him she had not previously articulated. He was shaped by the same quality of attention his father had possessed. He had simply applied it to a different field. Raymond wrote about the coins with the excitement of a person who has found the thing that makes the world make sense to them. The early letters from the late 1950s had the quality of discovery, the pleasure of a man realizing that a new field was going to be as rich and as demanding as he had hoped. By the mid-1960s, the letters had changed. The excitement was still present, but it had deepened into something more considered, the tone of a man who understood not just the objects, but the responsibility of understanding them. And Vivienne was in the letters. Not in every letter, not even in most of them, but she was there, appearing first in 1963, as a woman George had apparently expressed some curiosity about, and whom Raymond described in a single sentence that Clara read 3 times before moving forward. He wrote, "She is the kind of person who makes you feel that your interior life is worth having." She sat with that sentence for a while. Then she continued reading. The letters confirmed what Rosalind had told her, that Raymond's feeling for Vivienne was real and lasting and entirely unexpressed, a private fact he carried not as a wound, but as a sustaining certainty. He wrote about her the way people write about the things they are most sure of, without drama, without complaint, with the straightforward acknowledgement of something that simply was. He never suggested that he wished it were otherwise, or that the arrangement was insufficient. He seemed, reading the letters across the span of years, to have understood from very early that what he and Vivienne had was complete in itself and did not require a different form to be fully real. What struck Clara most was not this, though it moved her deeply. What struck her was a letter from 1971 in which Raymond described, with the precision he brought to everything he cared about, his developing thinking about the collection's future. He had been ill that year, a scare that turned out to be less serious than feared, but which had apparently clarified his thinking considerably. He wrote to George about the problem of legacy, by which he did not mean fame or recognition, but the simpler and more urgent question of what happens to the things you love when you are no longer able to love them. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what makes a person the right keeper of a thing. Not the most knowledgeable, not the most experienced, but the right keeper. I think it has to do with whether they understand the thing as a responsibility rather than a possession. Vivienne understands it that way. She always has. She would never claim the collection as her own in any sense that would diminish it. She holds it the way you hold something that belongs to the future, knowing that your job is to hand it forward in better condition than you found it. He wrote further in the same letter, in a passage that Clara photographed with her phone because she did not trust her memory to hold it intact. The danger with collections like this one is not that they will be lost. Objects are resilient. The danger is that they will be found by people who understand their market value but not their historical meaning, who will disperse them in the service of profit and leave the story they tell incomplete, the way you would dismantle a sentence to sell the individual letters and then wonder why no one could read it. What I am preserving is not the objects. It is the sentence. She photographed this and then sat back and looked at the ceiling of Harriet's archive room, which was the pressed tin ceiling of a 19th century building, ornate and slightly uneven with age, and thought about what it meant that this man, who had died before she was old enough to know his name, had articulated with such precision the thing she was now trying to do with the foundation. She had arrived at the same understanding through a completely different path and had thought of it as her own insight. And it genuinely was. But it was also something that Raymond had understood 40 years before her, and that Vivienne had understood by holding it in trust for 40 years. And that was now available to her because a book dealer in San Francisco had not known what else to do with a box of letters in 1991. This, she thought, was how things survived. Not through grand gestures or deliberate planning, but through the accumulated small decisions of people who recognized that certain things were worth handling carefully and handled them carefully, and passed them to the next careful pair of hands. She told Harriet that afternoon that she would like to discuss a formal relationship between the foundation and the archive, a way of ensuring that the Callaway materials were integrated into the record the foundation was building. Harriet looked at her over the reading glasses and said that she had hoped she would say that, and then she went to make tea with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has been waiting for a particular conversation to become possible and is now ready to have it properly. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Every single one of you watching is part of why we keep telling these stories. She stayed in Philadelphia for 3 days. On the second day, Harriet took her to the archive's reading room, a long, quiet room at the back of the building where researchers came to work with the materials, and introduced her to a graduate student named Petra, who was writing a dissertation on mid-century American collecting culture, and who had been using the archive for 2 years, and who reacted to Clara's presence with the barely controlled excitement of a person who has been reading about something and suddenly finds themselves sitting across a table from it. Petra was 27, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone carrying more information in their head than their face knows how to fully manage. And she asked Clara questions with a directness that Clara found immediately likable. Questions that were not about the money or the discovery, but about the experience of looking at the dresser, about what it felt like to find the seam, about how she had known to press in 2 places simultaneously. She was interested in the epistemology of the discovery, the way the knowledge had been transmitted and received, the gap between what Vivienne had explicitly taught and what she had transmitted without explicit instruction. Clara answered these questions as carefully and honestly as she could, which meant sometimes saying she did not know, and sometimes saying she thought she knew but was not certain, and sometimes saying something that surprised her in the saying of it, as answers sometimes do when the question is precise enough to open a door you had not previously located. Toward the end of their conversation, Petra said something that stayed with Clara through the flight home and the weeks that followed. She said, What strikes me about your aunt is that she made the decision very early not to be the story. She made herself the container of the story instead. And that's an extraordinarily difficult choice, because it means accepting that the recognition will come to someone else, if it comes at all. Most people can't do that. Most people need the story to be about them in some legible way. Clara thought about this on the plane, watching the winter landscape of the eastern seaboard pass below her, the grid of cities giving way to the dark patches of forest and the silver threads of rivers. She thought about Vivienne walking to the park every morning and returning her library books and making her coffee strong and raising a child who had lost her mother. All of it done with the same quality of attention and care. None of it done for an audience, none of it done with any apparent expectation of acknowledgement. She thought that her aunt had not thought of herself as the container of anything. She had thought of herself as someone who had been given a responsibility and was meeting it. And the meeting of it had been the whole point. And the story had never needed to be about her for the work to be real. She also thought, pressing her forehead against the cold oval of the airplane window and watching a river catch the last light far below, that this was the thing she most wanted to pass on. Not the foundation, not the coins, not the careful system for identifying objects at risk. The capacity to do important work without requiring the work to announce itself. To hold something significant with enough lightness that it could breathe. The winter passed. The Foundation's first year of operation resulted in 3 successful interventions, objects identified, conversations initiated, permanent institutional homes arranged. None of these made news. All of them mattered. Will at the Smithsonian sent her a brief email after each one, factual and warm in equal measure, the kind of email that manages to communicate genuine enthusiasm without performing it. She had come to value his emails more than she fully understood, and to recognize in them a quality she associated with certain students who had the gift of communicating exactly as much as they meant, without the cushioning that most people add to protect themselves from being fully heard. Rosalind called every few weeks, and they talked about Vivienne in the easy way of 2 people comparing notes on a shared subject they both know well and can be honest about. Rosalind had opinions about everything and stated them in the direct manner of a woman who had reached 84 by deciding that the time for indirectness had passed. She thought Raymond had been wrong not to tell Vivienne how he felt, not because it would have changed anything, but because Vivienne had deserved to know that someone had loved her that fully. She thought David Calloway seemed like a good man doing his best with a complicated inheritance. She thought the Foundation was exactly right, and that if Vivienne could see it, she would be satisfied, not proud in any demonstrative sense, but satisfied, which was how Vivienne had experienced all the things she approved of, with a quiet, contained satisfaction that was visible only to those who knew her well enough to read the specific way her posture changed when something was as it should be. On a Saturday in February, the 1-year anniversary of the first letter from Rosalind, Clara was in the garden pulling the last of the dead growth from the rose canes when she found, tucked into the space between the stone she had placed for Hector and the base of the oldest cane, a small tin box. It was not buried. It had been placed deliberately against the stone in the protected corner where the cane arched over it. The tin was old, its painted surface worn to a uniform silver except for traces of what had once been a blue and white pattern along the lid. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment, the way she had looked at the seam in the dresser panel before pressing it, with the particular quality of attention that her aunt had spent 40 years teaching her to bring to things that seemed to be asking to be understood. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of chamois leather that was soft with age, was a single coin. Not gold this time. Silver, with the heavy, substantial weight of a large silver coin, slightly larger than a modern dollar. On its face, a seated figure, draped and classical, a shield at her side, stars arranged in an arc above. On the reverse, an eagle, and below it, the date, 1847, and below the date, the denomination in small letters, $1. She turned it over twice, feeling the relief of the engraving under her fingers, and then held it up to the pale February light. The silver caught the brightness and held it, throwing a small, cold gleam across the stone below. She knew enough now to know what she was looking at. She knew enough to know that a seated Liberty silver dollar from 1847 in this condition, held in chamois leather in a tin box in a garden in Portland, Oregon, was not a casual thing. She knew enough to know that it had not been placed here by accident or forgotten through carelessness. She sat in the cold garden for a long time, the coin in her palm, the bare roses arching over the stone, August watching her from the kitchen window with his habitual expression of calm expectation. The February light moved across the garden in the particular way of winter light that never quite commits to warmth, but provides, and for a few hours in the middle of the day, a clarity that almost compensates. She thought about what Vivienne had known, and when she had known it, and how much of what she had arranged had been arranged specifically for Clara, and how much had simply been arranged because the work required it, and she had accepted long ago that she would probably never be able to fully separate these two things. Her aunt had been a woman of comprehensive practicality. She had never done anything purely for sentiment, but she had also never done anything without knowing what it would mean to the person who came after. The tin box, placed at Hector's stone, in the garden that Clara tended now, containing a coin she had not known was there. It was a message. It was a continuation. It was Vivienne saying something she had apparently not finished saying, or saying it in a way that required the passage of time for the full meaning to be audible. She went inside and called Gerald Fitch, who answered on the second ring with the unhurried manner of a man who had expected to hear from her at some point, and was not surprised that the point had arrived. She described the coin. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, with the carefully controlled tone of someone managing their own reaction, "You should bring it in. Today, if you can." She went that afternoon, the coin in its chamois cloth in her coat pocket. August locked inside with his food and his water and his collection of opinions about her absences. Gerald examined it for a long time under his loupe, turning it in the light, setting it down, picking it up again. When he finally looked up, his expression had the quality she had first seen at the dresser, that specific compound of professional reserve and barely managed astonishment. But this time, there was something else in it as well. Something almost like recognition. He told her that the coin was in extraordinary condition for its age, consistent with the kind of careful storage the chamois leather represented. He told her it was a desirable and significant coin, its value in the range of $40,000 to $60,000 depending on a formal grading. He told her all of this in the precise, measured way he brought to valuations, and then he stopped and looked at her directly. He said, "Your aunt knew this was here. She said she knew." He said, "And she left it separately, not with the others." She said yes. He was quiet for a moment, for looking at the coin on the velvet surface of his examination table. Then he said, "I wonder if she wanted you to decide what to do with this one yourself, without the weight of the rest of it, without the foundation or the archive or any of it. Just you and the object, and the question of what it means." Clara picked up the coin. The weight of it was familiar now, the familiar heft of old silver, the familiar feeling of holding something that had been held by many pairs of hands across many years, and had arrived in this particular pair of hands for reasons that were never entirely knowable and were always worth trying to understand. She thought about Petra saying that Vivienne had made herself the container of the story rather than the story itself. She thought about Raymond, writing that what he was preserving was not the objects, but the sentence. She thought about her students standing in the exhibition room in front of the small, still life with the box in the background, and Priya asking what was in the box, and her own answer, that the question itself was the right one. She thought that perhaps the coin was not a test, and not a message in any straightforward sense, but something more like a door, the same kind of door that the dresser panel had been, not hiding something to be revealed once and then known, but opening onto the ongoing question of what responsible stewardship looked like when you were doing it in real time, without the structure of a discovered archive to guide you, just the object and the question and the quality of attention you brought to both. She held the coin for another moment, feeling the weight of it, the weight of the history it had passed through and the history it was still passing through. And then she set it back on the velvet and looked at Gerald and said, "What would you do with it?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said he would probably give it to someone who needed it to understand, something they were not yet able to understand any other way. He said that was what the best objects did, not increase in value in a vault somewhere, but find the moment and the person where they could be most useful. She nodded slowly. She said, "I think I know who that is." She drove home through the late afternoon light, the coin in her pocket, the city moving past her windows with its ordinary complexity, the shops and the school buildings and the parks and the houses holding their various secrets in the usual way, of places where people have been living their various lives for a long time. She parked in front of the house and sat for a moment before going in, the way she sometimes sat before going into a room where something important was waiting, giving herself the pause that the moment warranted. Then she went inside and fed August and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 letters, one to Petra in Philadelphia, enclosing the coin with instructions that she could accept it, study it, and eventually find it the right home when she understood what that meant, which Clara believed she would. One to Will at the Smithsonian, not enclosing anything but telling him about the tin box and what Gerald had said and what she had decided, because she thought he would understand why she had decided it, and she wanted someone to understand. She sealed both envelopes and set them on the table and looked at them for a moment in the kitchen light. August jumped onto the chair across from her and regarded her with the steady, yellow-eyed patience of a cat who has lived in a house that knows what it is for and is in no hurry about anything. Outside, the February garden held its quiet order in the dark, the rose canes bare and waiting, the stone marking a life briefly and truly lived, the small empty depression in the corner where the tin box had rested through however many seasons it had rested there, now open to the air, the secret delivered, the work continued. There is always more, Clara thought. There is always another layer under the one you found, another door behind the panel, another question inside the answer. This is not a problem. This is the whole point. The work doesn't end. The work isn't supposed to end. The people who understand this are the ones who can carry it, and the people who can carry it are the ones worth passing it to. She finished her coffee. She would mail the letters in the morning. She was, at last, entirely ready for whatever the work asked next. Petra wrote back in 10 days. The letter was handwritten, which Clara had not expected from someone 27 years old, and it was 4 pages long, which she also had not expected, and it began with a sentence that made her stand at the mailbox in the cold morning air and read it twice before going inside. And she wrote, "I have been carrying the coin in my coat pocket every day since it arrived, not because I intend to keep it that way, but because I wanted to understand what it felt like to be responsible for something you did not choose and cannot fully know the meaning of yet." Clara folded the letter and went inside, and made coffee, and read the rest of it at the kitchen table, with August watching her from across the room with the particular attention he reserved for moments when she was clearly moved by something. He did not come closer. He seemed to understand, in the way that cats occasionally seem to understand, that proximity was not what the moment required. Petra wrote about the coin's history, which she had researched with the thoroughness of someone for whom research was not a method, but a reflex. The 1847 seated Liberty dollar had been designed by Christian Gobrecht, who had also designed the seated figure that appeared on American coins for decades, a design chosen in part because the seated posture communicated not passivity, but watchful readiness, a figure at rest, but entirely alert. She wrote about the mint marks and the strike quality, and the population reports that graded coins were measured against, and she wrote about all of this with the compressed precision of someone who had learned to put a great deal of information into a small space without losing any of it. Then the letter shifted, the way Petra's thinking shifted in conversation, quickly and without warning, from the historical to the personal. She wrote that she had been thinking about what it meant to receive something from a stranger, and more specifically, what it meant to receive something from a stranger on the recommendation of someone she had only met once, on the basis of a judgment made in a single afternoon's conversation. She wrote that she had at first been uncertain whether to accept it, not because she doubted the gesture, but because she was aware of the weight of what accepting it meant. She wrote that she had eventually understood that the uncertainty itself was the appropriate response, that confidence about receiving something like this would have been the wrong sign, and that the discomfort of not being sure she deserved it was probably part of what the whole arrangement was designed to teach. This, Clara thought, reading the fourth page in the kitchen light while her coffee cooled, was exactly right. This was the person the coin had been waiting for. She wrote back the same afternoon. They began a correspondence that settled into a rhythm of every 3 weeks, sometimes longer, never shorter. The rhythm of two people who had enough to say that they needed time between letters to accumulate it. Petra's letters were always handwritten. Clara's were sometimes typed when she was busy, and sometimes handwritten when she had the time to think slowly enough that her hand could keep up with the thinking. The letters were not about the coin specifically after the first exchange, though the coin hovered behind them the way significant objects hover behind the conversations of people who understand that the objects are not the point, but are never entirely beside the point either. They wrote about work, about the experience of caring for things that could not advocate for themselves. Petra wrote about a collection of letters she had found in the archive that summer, the correspondence of a woman who had spent 30 years as a domestic worker in a wealthy Philadelphia household and had documented, in careful weekly letters to her sister in Georgia, the precise details of the objects she lived among and tended, their histories as told to her by the family, her own assessments of those histories, which were frequently more accurate than the family's. The letters were extraordinary, Petra wrote, and almost no one knew they existed, and she was writing her dissertation chapter about them with the conviction that they constituted one of the most important first-person accounts of American collecting culture in the 20th century, and with the concurrent anxiety that the people who decided what was important in her field were not yet prepared to agree with her. Clara recognized this anxiety. She had felt it herself in her early years of teaching, the gap between what she knew mattered and what the institution she worked within was prepared to validate. She wrote back about this, and about the particular discipline required to continue doing work you believe in while waiting for the moment when the larger world catches up, and about her aunt, who had practiced this discipline across 4 decades with a consistency that Clara still found, a year and more into understanding it, genuinely remarkable. She also wrote about something that had been growing in her thinking since the Philadelphia trip, an idea she had not yet fully articulated to anyone else, and partly because it was not fully formed, and partly because she was aware that it would change things if she said it out loud to the people it most concerned. She was thinking about the house, not selling it. She had no intention of selling it, and would not have had the capacity to do so, even if she had wanted to, because the house had become, in the year since she moved into it, the kind of place that you understand. You will leave only when you die, and possibly not even then. She was thinking about the house in a different sense. She was thinking about what it could be, not only what it already was. It was a librarian's house. It was a collector's house, in the sense that Raymond had used the word, a place where things had been kept not for their market value, but for what they could teach. It had rooms that had not yet found their purpose, a back bedroom that was now Clara's, but which held the dresser, and by extension held everything the dresser represented. A front room that had been Vivienne's reading room, and was now the Foundation's informal meeting space, but was not yet fully what it could be. She had been thinking about opening it, not to the public in any broad or formal sense, not as a museum, which would require resources and bureaucracies, and a logic of display that felt at odds with everything the house was about. Something smaller, more specific, more aligned with what the house had always been, a place where things were preserved and examined and understood, a place where the right people could come and look closely at things and learn in the way that Clara had learned, by contact with objects that had been handled with intention. She wrote to Petra about this first, because Petra was far enough away and recent enough an acquaintance that she could write to her without the writing immediately becoming a plan. She wrote it as a question rather than a proposal. She wrote, "I keep thinking about the house as a place where the kind of education my aunt gave me could be given deliberately and systematically, not through a curriculum, but through exposure. Putting certain people in rooms with certain objects and trusting the objects to do what they do. I don't know yet what shape this takes. I wonder if you have thoughts." Petra's response, which came in 2 weeks and was 5 pages, the longest she had written, said that she had been thinking something similar from the other direction, that the archive in Philadelphia held more material than any single dissertation could address, and that what the material needed was not more scholarship, not exactly, but more pairs of eyes that understood how to look at it in the right way. She said that the two problems might be the same problem approached from opposite ends. She said that she had mentioned the house to Harriet, who had said, characteristically, that it was about time someone thought of it. The word that kept recurring in Petra's letter was a word that Clara had not used herself, but that felt immediately correct when she read it. The word was residency. What the house might offer, Petra wrote, was a form of residency, a defined period of time in which a person who needed to be in sustained contact with significant objects could live with them, handle them, and understand them in the way that only extended proximity permits. Not a museum, not a classroom. A residency, like the residencies offered to artists, which were based on the understanding that certain kinds of work require a certain quality of uninterrupted attention that ordinary working life cannot provide. Clara took this word and turned it over for several weeks, testing it against the rooms of the house and against the principles she had arrived at through the year of discovery. She tested it against what she knew of her aunt, who had herself lived in a kind of permanent residency with the objects she tended. She tested it against Raymond's letters, particularly the passage about the sentence, and found that the word accommodated everything she wanted the house to be, a place where people came to spend time with the sentence rather than merely to catalog the letters. She brought it to the Foundation in March at the 2nd annual meeting, which was held, as the first had been, in the reading room. Gerald and Marcus and Will and Rosalind, who had come up again from Pasadena and who arrived, as before, exactly on time, and with the upright bearing of someone who had not once in 84 years been late to anything that mattered. She laid out the idea without embellishment, the way her aunt had laid things out, with the language precisely fitted to the thing being described and no extra material around it. She said, "I think the house should become a residency for people working in the field of material culture, broadly understood. People who need sustained access to significant objects in order to do work that matters. It would be small. 3 residents at a time, perhaps, for periods of 3 months. The foundation would provide housing and access to the collection and to the archive we are developing in partnership with Harriet. It would not provide stipends, at least not initially. It would provide the thing my aunt provided, which is an environment designed to teach you to look closely at things you would otherwise look at too quickly." She stopped and let the room be quiet for a moment, and then she looked at Rosalind, because Rosalind was the person in the room who had known Vivienne longest, and would therefore have the most honest reaction. Rosalind said, she would have found the word residency slightly grandiose, but she would have thought the idea was right. There was a pause, and then Marcus laughed, and then everyone else did too. And after that, the conversation was productive in the specific way of conversations, where everyone at the table is working toward the same thing and has enough trust in each other to say clearly when an idea is wrong without needing to apologize for saying so. They talked for 2 hours. By the end, the residency had a shape that was recognizably what Clara had proposed, and also better than she had proposed it, sharpened by Gerald's practicality and Will's knowledge of how similar programs functioned at institutions he had studied, and Marcus's understanding of what working scholars actually needed, as opposed to what institutions assumed they needed. Rosalind said, near the end, that she wanted to donate something to the residency. Not money, which she also offered, but something more specific. She said she had, in a storage unit in Pasadena, a collection of Raymond's books, the ones he had held back from selling over the decades, the ones that had been on the shelves of the bookshop when he closed it. She had been keeping them because she had not known what else to do with them, and because she had been unable to bring herself to donate them to a library where they would be cataloged into anonymity. She thought they belonged here, in the house where the collection had lived, in rooms where people who understood books the way Raymond had understood them would be able to use them. Clara said yes before Rosalind had finished the sentence, and the old woman smiled with the small, contained satisfaction that Clara had come to recognize as her highest form of approval. The residency opened in September. The first cohort was 3 people, chosen through a process that Clara had designed to be deliberately different from the application processes she had encountered in her professional life, which tended to reward people who were already recognized rather than people who were ready. She had asked applicants to submit not a CV or a project proposal, but a description of a single object they had encountered that had changed how they thought about something, written in as much or as little space as it required. She had received 41 applications and had read all of them herself, sometimes twice, and had made her choices on the basis of the one criterion she trusted: whether the writing demonstrated the capacity to see past the surface. The 3 she chose were Petra, who had been the obvious choice from the beginning, and who moved into the back bedroom with the coin and a shipping box of dissertation research materials and the calm efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for years without knowing it. A retired museum conservator from Seattle named Owen, who was 63 and had spent his career caring for objects other people had made decisions about and wanted, now to spend time thinking about what the objects themselves had to say, free from institutional pressures that had shaped every professional decision of his working life. And a young man named Felix, who was 24 and had grown up in Portland and had written about a battered pocket knife his grandfather had carried for 50 years, describing it in 3 pages that were so precise and so unsentimental and so genuinely attentive that Clara had read them on a Tuesday evening and known immediately that he belonged in the house. The three of them moved in on a Thursday in September, and Clara showed them the dresser on the first morning, the way her aunt had shown her things, without ceremony and without explanation, simply opening the panel and letting them look and waiting for what the looking produced. Owen crouched in front of the compartment for several minutes without speaking. Petra put her hand flat against the walnut surface, the way Clara had on the evening she finally understood what she had inherited. Felix, who was 24 and had never seen anything quite like this, asked a single question so quietly, Clara almost didn't hear it. He asked how long it had been waiting. She thought about this question for the rest of the day. The answer was 60 years, roughly, if you counted from when Raymond had first entrusted the collection to Vivienne. But it was also longer than that, because the dresser itself was older, had been in the family before Raymond, had been brought from Astoria, where Vivienne had grown up, had stood in rooms Clara had never seen, and been touched by hands whose names she did not know. The compartment had been built into the dresser before it reached Vivienne, and someone before her had understood that a well-made piece of furniture could hold more than its surface suggested. Someone before her had found it useful to have a space that only careful looking would reveal. The answer, she had come to believe, was that things like the dresser did not wait in a passive sense. They persisted. They maintained their integrity across time and through the various hands that held them, and the waiting was not inert, but active, a kind of ongoing readiness that required only the right quality of attention to become the right conversation. In the evenings that first week, after the residents had gone to their rooms and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara sat in the reading room with the books Rosalind's movers had delivered the previous week, which now filled the shelves that had previously held Vivienne's collection. The transition had been managed carefully. Vivienne's books boxed and moved to the back of the house where they would form part of the working library available to residents. Raymond's books installed in the reading room in the order that Rosalind had maintained since she had collected them from the bookshop. The order was not alphabetical or categorical in any obvious way. It was the order of a man's working mind, the order in which the books had spoken to each other in his thinking. History shelved beside technical manuals, beside art criticism, beside natural history, beside literature. The connections visible only once you understood the sensibility that had made them. It was, Clara thought, its own kind of map, not the same kind of map that Samuel had etched into the walls of the tree in the story she had always loved. The record of a lifetime of attention rendered in the arrangement of accumulated things. She sat among these books on the last evening of the first week and felt the particular quality of fullness that she had come to associate with the house at its best, when the various threads of what it held were all present and audible at once. She could hear the residents moving in the rooms above her. She could feel, in the old way she had always felt with the dresser, the presence of something that had been maintained and passed forward and was now being received again by the right hands. August came in from wherever he had been and jumped into the chair across from her and regarded her with his usual yellow-eyed composure. The reading lamp threw its familiar circle of light across the table. The books stood in their inherited order on the shelves. Outside, the September garden was still warm enough to hold some of its summer, the rose canes not yet stripped, the borders still green at their edges. The stone for Hector was visible from where she sat, if she leaned slightly toward the window, a pale shape in the dimming light. She thought about Felix's question. How long had it been waiting? She thought that the right answer, the one she had not given him because she had not yet found it when he asked, was this. It had been waiting as long as the people who tended it had understood what they were tending. The dresser had not changed. The coins had not changed. The letters in their cedar chest had not changed. What had changed, what always changed, was the capacity of the person holding them to understand what they held. Her aunt had spent 40 years becoming that person, and then she had spent 40 years making Clara into that person. And now Clara was spending her remaining years doing the same work for the people who came to the house and sat with its objects and were changed by the sitting. Slowly, in the way that significant things changed you. Not all at once, but in layers, each layer requiring you to come back and look again. This was the work. It had no end point. It had no achievement that concluded it. It was a continuous act of attention, passed forward through time in the hands of people who were willing to carry it, which meant people who understood that carrying it was not a burden, but a form of belonging. She turned off the reading lamp. The room settled into the soft dark of a house that knows what it is for. Upstairs, the residents slept among the objects that were beginning, in the slow and patient way of significant things, to tell them what they needed to know. The work continued. It always would. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.